Hello, my name is Khan Ross. I am a former diplomat in the British Foreign Office. During my career, I headed the Israel-Palestine section of the Foreign Office and later led Middle East work in the UK mission to the United Nations, where, at the Security Council, I negotiated scores of resolutions on the situation in Palestine, Libya, and Iraq, including the 9/11 terror attacks and the weapons inspections in and sanctions on Iraq before the 2003 invasion. I resigned from the Foreign Office over the Iraq War after giving secret testimony about my work on weapons inspections and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the government's lies about them. Since then, as the founder of Independent Diplomat, I have advised leaders of democratic countries and political movements all over the world in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. I have written books and many articles about diplomacy and international affairs. I have worked with brave people fighting against dictatorship, genocide, and oppression from Western Sahara to Myanmar, from Syria to Sri Lanka. I continue to do so today. Today, I want to talk about complicity in genocide and the very grave possibility that the British government and other Western governments are, in fact, complicit in the genocide that's going on right now in Gaza. In particular, I want to talk about individual accountability of our ministers and senior officials. First, it's clear that Israel is committing genocide. Multiple legal experts have come to this conclusion based on the explicit statements of Israeli leaders, ministers, and military officials who have made literally hundreds of declarations of genocidal intent. A conclusion also based on Israel's conduct, which is also genocidal, the publicly declared and deliberate starvation of the entire population of Gaza, the disproportionate killing of women and children, the denial of medical supplies, water, fuel, and electricity, as well as the systematic destruction of Gaza's hospitals, bakeries, and other civilian infrastructure, all evidence of the intent and conduct required to establish genocide. The former British Supreme Court Judge Jonathan Sumption concluded that the most plausible explanation of current Israeli policy is that its object is to induce Palestinians as an ethnic group to leave the Gaza Strip for other countries by bombing, shooting, and starving them if they remain. A court would be likely to regard that as genocide. The Israeli genocide scholar and former IDF member Professor Omer Bartov judged on the evidence that Israel is committing genocide. "I know one when I see one," he said. UN special rapporteurs have reached the same conclusion, as have multiple authoritative organisations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. You can also look at the International Court of Justice preliminary opinion last year on South Africa's case of genocide against Israel. The ICJ issued binding orders on Israel to take certain measures to prevent acts of genocide and incitement of genocide. These measures are obligatory under the Genocide Convention to which Israel is a party. Israel has taken none of those measures. In fact, the opposite. It has not, for instance, allowed the entry of the necessary humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. It has instead brazenly announced that it is withholding aid, with the results that we can see today, where millions face deliberately induced famine and scores are dying from hunger every day. Israel is aided and abetted in these actions by other countries, above all the US, of course, but also countries like the UK, Germany, France, and others, by supplying weapons and other military assistance. The UK, for instance, despite claiming that it will not supply weapons that might be used in war crimes, has continued to supply parts for F-35 aircraft, which are used to bomb Gaza, claiming, implausibly, that it cannot stop such exports which are made to a common pool. This is nonsense. My suspicion is that the reason the UK doesn't stop the supply of parts is because the US is the F-35's lead manufacturer, and the UK doesn't want to annoy the US. Foreign Secretary Lamy, however, says that to stop supplying the parts would undermine the whole F-35 program. This too is obviously nonsense. Of course, the suppliers can stop sending parts to Israel. The UK announced late last year that it would stop licensing arms sales to Israel that may be used in war crimes. But Britain has stopped only 30 of 300 licenses for arms supplies to Israel. And since the announcement, official records show a surge in export licenses for military equipment and munitions, including items specifically described in customs codes as ammunition, explosives, bombs, grenades, and similar ordnance. Between September 2024, when the partial suspension of arms licenses was announced, and March this year, 3 months ago, there is evidence from Israeli tax records that the UK has supplied over 8,000 individual munitions to Israel, bombs, missiles, mines. These permits would have been signed off by officials and ministers sitting in Whitehall. Drone engines manufactured in Dorset are exported to Israel for use in large military quadcopters, robot killers, that fly over Gaza and bomb and deliberately shoot civilians, including children. Since Hamas's murderous attack on the 7th of October 2023, the UK has conducted over 500 RAF military surveillance flights over Gaza. The government refuses to answer questions about these flights, though it has said in the past that they are used to gather intelligence to help locate Israeli and particularly British hostages. These flights continue today, even though no British hostages remain in Gaza. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, says that they are not used to provide intelligence to the Israeli military, and this would be wrong. But the government itself has admitted that the detailed video filmed by these aircraft is shared with Israel. The claim that this intelligence is used only to help free hostages is simply not credible. Complicity is a crime under the Genocide Convention, agreed in 1948 in response to the mass atrocities committed by Nazi Germany before and during the Holocaust and the Second World War. It is a separate crime from genocide itself. It is a grave crime and punishable under international law, even if the complicit actor does not share the genocidal intent of those committing the acts of genocide. Notably, the Genocide Convention makes clear that its provisions apply not only to states but to individuals. The Nuremberg tribunals had firmly established the principle of individual accountability and criminal responsibility, an important cornerstone of international law. Article 4 of the Genocide Convention states that persons committing genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3, which includes complicity, shall be punished, whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. This is right. I know from my own experience that officials and ministers hide behind the protection of the state when doing terrible things, such as the sanctions that did immense harm to the Iraqi civilian population in the years before the 2003 invasion. I was part of that. No one has been held accountable. I remember thinking that even if the sanctions were illegal under international humanitarian law, nothing would happen to me because I was an operative of the state. I'm sure I would have questioned my actions more thoroughly had I feared that I might be prosecuted. I am today very ashamed of what I was part of. Many others, officials and now former ministers, are also culpable. Culturally and in the media, it seems that those in government should be treated differently when they commit crimes, particularly those undertaken under the guise of national security. Tony Blair and his cohorts are given a platform on national media, despite the fact that he launched an illegal and unnecessary war. That it was illegal and unnecessary is not just my view, and I worked on Iraq longer than almost any other British official at the time. It is also the view of every reputable international lawyer and the deputy legal advisor at the Foreign Office at the time, who resigned when the government ignored her advice. There are real consequences to such impunity. The invasion of Iraq cost an estimated 500,000 lives. It ignited violent extremism across that country and into Syria, creating ISIS and forcing out millions of refugees whose arrival in Europe has triggered a surge in support for the far right across the continent. And of course, other war criminals take their cue from witnessing such brazen illegality. The Russian foreign minister often cites the Iraq war when justifying Russia's bloody and unlawful invasion of Ukraine. The rule of law is undermined for all across the world with real consequences, namely thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of dead civilians. If you do terrible things when you're in government, including abetting or even instigating war crimes, as Blair did, you're given a kind of free pass. At worst, you might have to testify years later to a toothless public inquiry, like those that followed long after the Iraq War, and to which I also testified. But being in government when you take decisions about illegal invasions or sending weapons to those committing genocide should not be a free pass, and it is not, certainly in the case of genocide, as the Genocide Convention makes very clear. It is individuals, ministers and officials who take the decisions to abet genocide. It also includes, of course, Biden and Blinken, his Secretary of State, and also British, German and French ministers who chose to continue arms deliveries to Israel as it killed Palestinians in huge numbers, including, the UN told us last week, the equivalent of a classroom of children every single day, slaughter that cannot conceivably be justified as self-defense. Earlier this week, some of those governments condemned Israel's actions in killing civilians trying to collect food in Gaza. Yet they continue to supply weapons and, in Britain's case, intelligence gathered by the RAF. We don't know what other intelligence they may be providing. Meanwhile, Israeli officers continue to be trained in Britain, and Israeli aircraft stop over to refuel in British air bases. Imagine if Serbia was provided with intelligence by Britain as it conducted genocide in Bosnia, or the military in Myanmar as they slaughtered tens of thousands of Rohingya civilians. This is what Britain is doing with Israel. The Genocide Convention also places clear and binding obligation on its states parties to prevent genocide, to stop genocide. It is called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. You will often hear government ministers say that it is for the courts to judge whether Israel is committing genocide, and this means, of course, long after the event. But it is the obligation of signatories of the Genocide Convention to do everything they can to stop genocide from happening in the first place, and it is a serious violation not to do so. The US and UK and other Western countries could take many actions to force Israel to stop its genocide. They could place sanctions on all of Israel's leadership, including its prime minister, not just the two far-right extremists who sit in Israel's cabinet. They could cut off trade, they could expel the Israeli ambassador, they could prosecute their own citizens who fight for the IDF. They don't do any of these things. They are not only failing to stop the genocide, they are helping it to continue for nearly 2 years now. Instead, British ministers call Israel an ally, attend receptions given by Israel's ambassador where they boast about Britain's assistance to Israel, including those intelligence flights. This was just 2 months ago, when 55,000 Palestinians had already been killed. Only in May, 2 months ago, did the UK halt the negotiation of a new trade deal. While Israel has been indiscriminately bombing Palestinian civilians and laying Gaza to waste and deliberately starving the Palestinian population, British ministers were happy to discuss with Israel how to increase trade between them. In recent days, the head of Israel's Air Force had talks with RAF chiefs at an air show in England. This was a man who ordered Israeli bombers returning from attacking Iran to offload any unused bombs on Gaza. Which signal do you think Israel takes seriously, the rhetoric or the weapons, the outraged chest beating on TV news, or the thousands of gigabytes of intelligence data secretly supplied to the IDF? The words of condemnation in Parliament, or the warm words of support at Israeli diplomatic receptions? How will these individuals, such as Starmer, Lamy, Merz, Macron, Schulz or Baerbock, be held accountable for what they have done? In theory, their national courts, which are obliged to implement the Genocide Convention, should take it up. They have not. Indeed, a court in the UK recently ruled that arms sales to Israel were a matter for the executive, which is feeble and indeed wrong. National security should not be a kind of all-embracing excuse. But if national courts fail to act, the International Criminal Court is empowered to investigate. The UK, France and Germany are all parties to the Rome Statute, which obliges them to enforce the ICC's arrest warrants. The British government, like the German or French, make a big deal about how they stand up for international rule of law, and they boast about their support for institutions like the ICJ and ICC. Britain was central in the negotiation of the Rome Statute, which created the ICC. In fact, Britain's main negotiator was the legal advisor who advised that the invasion of Iraq was illegal. British judges and lawyers played a very full part in prosecuting genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda, and in prosecuting war criminals in those places. The law is clear, and you don't have to be a lawyer to understand it. I know it when I see it, as Dr. Omar Bartov put it. Killing children in the tens of thousands, shooting some in the head, burning others to death, deliberately starving all of them, is not self-defense by any definition. Deliberately denying food, water and medical supplies to an entire population is a clear breach of the Genocide Convention, and more specifically and recently, a clear breach of the specific and explicit obligations upon Israel ordered by the ICJ to prevent genocide. The Genocide Convention could not be more clear. It is obligatory to do everything you can to prevent genocide. Our ministers did not even try to do so. They aided and abetted it. It is obligatory to do everything you can to stop genocide when it takes place. Our ministers did not try to stop it. What is providing weapons, intelligence and political support to those committing genocide? It is complicity. Complicity is a crime. I hope that for the sake of the 2 million innocent civilians in Gaza, nearly half of them children, and for the sake of victims of other future genocides, the ICC and ICJ uphold the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Convention to the fullest extent. Abetting genocide is a grave crime, and the individuals who are complicit must be held accountable, not to some insipid inquiry years down the line, not to press or parliamentary questions that are never directly or honestly answered, but accountable to the law. Thank you.